Good idea.
Good.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, everybody, for coming on this early Friday morning before the holiday. I think we have a good discussion this morning on kind of one of these key issues that's not going away, whether we have Thanksgiving and Christmas or not. So it's kind of an important time to have this discussion. So this is going to be relatively informal. We're obviously not doing PowerPoint presentations. So I think what we're going to do is the speakers just kind of give some opening statements, and then we'll have a discussion. We'll go for 60, 70 minutes, and then kind of go from there. So my name is Matthew Stepp. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Clean Energy Innovation. We're a think tank in Washington that works on clean technology development, innovation policy. And this is kind of one of those foundational issues for us in the sense that clean tech trade, or just trade in general, is crucially important to whether clean energy becomes a viable market into the future and whether it continues to grow or not. And the reason being, it really comes down to innovation and whether or not clean energy really gains a significant foothold and transforms the global energy market comes down to whether or not we can spur innovation. And we need cheaper products, we need better products, and to get those products, we need to be able to sell them around the world. We need the biggest markets we can, so our companies, these global industries can sell them as much as they can reinvest that money back into research and development. And then there's kind of the second order impact, and this is something that my organization's worked on a lot, which we call green mercantilism, where other countries' energy policies can impact clean tech trade, which then impacts innovation. And these are things like local barriers to trade, dumping products in the market at below market rates. These type of policies actually undercut the market. They actually kick out competitors. They limit the ability of startups to enter into the market, limit the other companies' ability to invest in research and development. They move manufacturing around the world, which segments the innovation economy. And we've seen these impacts already. And you look at the solar market, particularly where for a couple of years, particularly right around the stimulus in the early 2000s, was rapidly growing. A lot of startup activity, a lot of SMEs entering the market, and then because of other countries' trade policies and solar policies, a lot of that market segment disappeared. And now we're in a lot of ways left with one or two dominant technologies in the market and very little ability for new technologies to enter. And that's troubling for the long-term ability of solar to be a viable and affordable technology. And similar cases can be made for wind, battery storage, and across the clean tech segment. So we have two really great speakers that know these issues inside and out, going to kind of give their diverse perspective on it. Jason Kearns, to my immediate right, is the Minority Chief Trade Counsel at the House Ways and Means Committee. He spends a lot of time in this room, I can imagine. So he's going to give the kind of congressional point of view. His standpoint is when being engaged in a lot of these trade negotiations and other trade issues. And then Timothy Brightfield, at his right, is a partner at Wiley Rein, where he represents clients on all aspects of international trade. And he's been deeply involved in the U.S.-China solar trade case, and he's going to speak on that, I believe, today, and give maybe an update on what's going on and how that's impacting the industry. So with that, I can start with Jason, and then there's really no time limit. So.
Okay, great. Well, I'll try to keep my comments fairly short so we can have more time for questions. But thanks for having me, Matt, and I wanted to thank ITIF for sponsoring this. When I was preparing for this today, I was reminded that the first time I heard about ITIF was about 5 years ago when they put out a report with the Breakthrough Institute, which I think you were affiliated with at one point, Rising Tiger, Sleeping Giant, about how Asian nations are set to dominate the clean energy race and by out-investing in the United States. The report really caught my eye. I think ITIF said a lot of things that nobody else seemed to really kind of have the courage to say about the need to sort of be more assertive at addressing these policies and be more active in countering them one way or another. I think as I was thinking about the title of this event today, Problems and Promise of Global Clean Tech Trade, and I think to me, the way to describe the problems is sort of, there's the problems here, there's the problems there, and those have led to the problems everywhere. And what I mean by that is the problems there, and people often talk, especially I've been on the Hill now for a little over 8 years now, so I was involved in the legislation, the climate change legislation that we passed through the House a few years ago that didn't make it through the Senate, and a number of other battles related to clean tech trade and climate change. And so the problems there, I mean, certainly China, but other countries like China that have, in a nutshell, I think they take a passive approach to reducing greenhouse gas consumption, but an active approach to increasing domestic production and exports, especially in clean tech and environmental goods. So it's essentially that's mercantilism and green mercantilism. So that problem takes a variety of forms. Obviously, massive production subsidies. As I said, many of those were identified and described in the Rising Tiger, Sleeping Giant report. Currency manipulation, not specific, not a green mercantilism issue, but a mercantilism issue that certainly affects all industries. Domestic content requirements, we've seen those probably more in clean tech than elsewhere, but we see them kind of across the board. Exports restraints on raw materials, including rare earths, which also has an impact on clean tech. Forced technology transfer and trade secret theft. All of those things I think have essentially given producers in other countries, especially in clean technologies, advantages that our producers don't have. I think the biggest one, and there's not nearly enough focus on this in my view, we think currency manipulation and all these others are quite big issues, but even bigger than that is the issue of retaliation, where in our view, a number of countries, including and especially China, maybe China uniquely, has threatened to retaliate against even actions as benign as the U.S. bringing a WTO case. There's threats of retaliation against our industries, and that's just not really playing by the global rules. We need to be following those global rules, and we haven't been. So that's the problem there. Again, sort of passive approach to reducing greenhouse gas consumption and an active approach to domestic production and export. The problem here, I think, is essentially the opposite. We've had an active approach to reducing greenhouse gas consumption, not a problem in and of itself, but a passive approach to greenhouse gas production, or even to trying to level the playing field. So what form has that taken? Well, we've seen a resistance to clean energy production subsidies, that's for sure. In fact, one of the big discussions right now or during this lame duck, we're not talking about a whole lot of things on the lame duck, but one thing we're talking about is a wind tax credit. And I noticed when I got in this morning that Senator Grassley had an interesting quote, which is, "I don't understand the argument that repealing a subsidy for oil or gas or nuclear energy production is a tax increase on energy producers and consumers, while repealing an incentive for alternative or renewable energy is not." But essentially that's the situation we're in right now, where there's just a great reluctance to providing any kinds of subsidies to encourage the production of clean technologies here. Another example, and to me this is maybe the best example of the passive approach we've taken to leveling the playing field. When I was involved in our work on the climate change bill, and essentially to put in place caps on greenhouse gases, Ways and Means involvement on this, or at least our trade involvement on this, was that we recognize the issue of carbon leakage. In other words, if we're doing something to address greenhouse gas consumption here in the United States and other countries are not, there will be a natural incentive for producers to relocate to other countries like China and produce there. And not only is that bad for the U.S. economy, it also completely undermines the climate change objective. And so we were working on ways to put in place border adjustments so that imports are not given a competitive advantage over U.S. production, that we essentially try to level the playing field and ensure that, that they're essentially not able to price undercut U.S. producers that face higher production costs as a result of climate change legislation. And even though, quite surprisingly, the WTO, right before the legislation was passed, indicated that that's actually consistent with WTO rules and probably a very good way of moving forward. Nevertheless, some pretty reputable people in the United States describe this as Smoot-Hawley all over again. Smoot-Hawley being the massive tariff increases coming out of the Great Depression that helped contribute to the Great Depression. Again, all we were trying to do is level the playing field in a way that was consistent with WTO rules. And it just, to me, shows how passive we are when it comes to not only incentivizing production of clean technologies here, but also just doing all we can to level the playing field with other countries that have taken mercantilist approaches to these technologies. Also, there's been just another example, an unwillingness to address currency manipulation, which again gives producers in other countries an advantage, not something specific to clean tech, but definitely affects it. So that's the problem there, that's been the problem here, that leads to the problem everywhere, I think, and that is that, more recently there's been an unwillingness, I think, in the US to do much to address climate change because the argument is made it's just going to lead to loss of jobs here and jobs in other places, and jobs flowing to other countries. It doesn't have to be that way. What we have to do is, again, address the problem there and address the problem here. I think to some extent there's signs that things may be moving in the right direction. We'll see how the meeting in Paris goes next year, but obviously the announcement from China and the US suggests that maybe China is more willing than it was in the past to take a more active approach to greenhouse gas consumption there, so that's a step in the right direction. And so now I think the question is, are we going to do more to take a more assertive approach to green mercantilism? I think there's some suggestions that we are willing to do that. We were encouraged that the administration created the Interagency Trade Enforcement Center to help build cases to address WTO violations, and some of those will definitely come in clean technology sectors. Another interesting idea, again from the ITIF, is this global mercantilism report, something that better identifies the problems we have with other countries when it comes to mercantilism. Those sorts of things I think are what we need, that sort of more assertive approach to addressing these problems in other countries. Also, there's some hope that some of the trade agreements we're negotiating now, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, can help to address some of these issues as well. State-owned enterprises, hopefully something good on to help address some of the environmental issues in trade as well. So there's reason for hope there as well. And then I think the other thing we just have to do is do more to support U.S. clean technology production here. And I was looking over the report beyond 2015. I guess this sort of that ITIF put together, and it lays out, I think, pretty persuasively the need to not only do more to support these technologies here, but to to really incentivize cutting-edge research and development, and I think that's where Congress needs to play a more active role. So hopefully things are moving in the right direction, and we're beginning to address both the problem there and the problem here, but I think we still have quite a ways to go on that. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Ted? You're up.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate the invitation and all the work that ITIF has done on this issue. And Jason, I agree with almost all of those comments, and we can build on them a little bit in the Q&A period. I wanted to talk mostly focusing on solar energy, since that's the main interest of my client, Solar World. Just at some of the forces and factors that are affecting green energy trade today. And some of the news is good. We really have, in the last year, a recovery going on in terms of U.S. solar manufacturing. I brought a couple of pieces of paper with me as well, which are out on the table there. One is an article from PB Tech publication, which talks about North America's amazing PV module manufacturing turnaround, announced new capacity of more than 2 gigawatts of solar manufacturing here in the United States. Solar World is one of the companies that is doing that. Had the opportunity to go out a couple of weeks ago and watch as Solar World announced the hiring of 200 workers and a significant expansion of its capacity to make solar panels here in the United States. But it's not just Solar World. There have been announcements that would affect or add solar manufacturing in New York State, in Michigan, in Texas, all across the United States. So that's the good news, and I think there are 3 things driving that turnaround that hopefully will continue. One is the return of fair trade to the U.S. market, and I'll talk about that. I'll talk about the trade cases, which some of you might have questions about. Second, there is increased and growing demand for green energy in general, but also specifically for solar here in the United States. We're seeing that's a very encouraging sign, and it's continuing and is expected to continue in the future. And third, I think, is technology improvement. These products are becoming better and more efficient every year, and the United States is helping to lead that, and that's part of the reason why it's so important to have U.S. solar manufacturing here in the United States, to have the innovation here. And this is something that ITIF is focused on a lot. There are some who say, why do we care if China simply wants to dump solar panels here at the lowest cost? Isn't that good for everyone? And the answer is no, it's not good, because the next generation of solar will be developed and should be developed by manufacturers and companies here. That's been the history of solar and Solar World for almost 40 years, and we see that continuing. So with that as an introduction, I'll just talk a little bit about the solar trade cases that have been going on and are still ongoing. And I think they really are a demonstration of how fair trade is essential for a robust, competitive, renewable energy manufacturing sector in the United States. It's taken a while to get there, and we're not done yet. What we saw just a few years ago was China's focus on this sector, the renewable energy sector, and solar in particular, as laid out in its 5-year plans, specific strategy to take over solar manufacturing, to build world-dominating capacity, not for use in China, which desperately needs clean energy in all forms, but to export it to the United States and the European Union and elsewhere. And so you saw that laid out in China's 5-year plans, and you saw massive subsidies going to China's manufacturing industry. Grants, loans, and loan guarantees in the tens of billions of dollars, discounted raw materials, a whole range of subsidies that are not permitted under WTO law or US law. What happened as a result of that? You quickly saw a collapse in pricing of solar products. Not just 8% to 10% a year, which is what happens in the solar industry as these products get better and better, that you saw a collapse of 50 or 60% in prices for a couple of years, which completely undermined U.S. pricing in the U.S. industry. And unfortunately, the next thing you saw was that U.S. Industry couldn't compete with the government of China. So you saw bankruptcies, you saw hundreds and thousands of workers laid off, and you saw plant closures, more than 20 plant closures in the last few years here in the United States. So the way that was addressed, or that we've tried to address this, is that SolarWorld filed 2 trade cases. The first case in late 2011 at the peak of the import surge. And by the way, at that point, in the year 2011, Chinese imports of solar panels were about $3 billion into the United States. And I was told that that accounted for 1% of all of China's exports to the United States at that point, was solar products, which is just amazing given how vast their export economy is. So the cases were filed in 2011. SolarWorld successfully showed that the U.S. domestic industry was being harmed by these dumped and subsidized imports from China. And anti-dumping and anti-subsidy duties were imposed at about 30% on Chinese panels and Chinese cells coming into the United States. That happened at the end of 2012. That first round of trade cases concluded. Unfortunately, there was a loophole left in those cases. The Commerce Department determined to cover most Chinese products, but to leave uncovered Chinese solar panels made with solar cells from another country. And most notably, Taiwan makes a lot of solar cells. And so, even while these first trade cases were going on, we saw a rapid shift announced publicly, wasn't secret, all of these Chinese companies said they were doing it, to start using Taiwanese solar cells in their panels. And so we saw the same unfair trade practices continue, the same subsidies, the same dumping, but now it was just with Taiwanese and other cells in these solar panels. Unfortunately, the U.S. industry got some relief from the first round of trade cases, but still heavy losses, even more companies closed, more harm to the U.S. industry. And so at the very end of last year, SolarWorld filed a second set of trade cases to try and close that loophole, covering both China and Taiwan. That was filed December 31st. Those cases are going on right now. Currently, as we speak, there have been affirmative preliminary determinations from against both countries, China and Taiwan, and very sizable dumping and subsidy margins in place, even higher than the first trade case. For Taiwan, actually they range around 20 to 28%. For Chinese producers, they're in more in the 40 to 50% range. So very sizable duties. The Commerce Department has found that China and Taiwan are still dumping, and that there are heavy subsidies in place that are benefiting Chinese production as well. We're nearing the end of those cases. All of the information has been submitted to the Commerce Department. They'll make their final determination in December, mid-December. And then the International Trade Commission must find, once again, that the U.S. industry is injured by reason, at least in part, of the Chinese and Taiwanese imports. So that'll go on in December. There will be a hearing, there'll be some briefs, and then the ITC will make its injury determination in January of next year. So we're very near the end of those cases, and we, again, feel like we have a very strong case on the injury side, and that there will be sizable margins put in place. And we've seen already, with the preliminary duties in place, this recovery of manufacturing here in the United States. We've seen new capacity announced, and we've seen product innovations. We've seen some grants going to the U.S. industry. SolarWorld just received a matching grant from the Energy Department to develop advanced solar cells. So all the kinds of things that demonstrate that in the right environment, with a level playing field, the U.S. industry can compete. China does not have a comparative advantage in making solar panels. The raw materials are here. The equipment is the same in the United States and China. This is an industry where the United States can excel, where it can add jobs, where it can add new factories and facilities, and really lead us in the 21st century. So we look forward to being at the leading edge of that. One point that I wanted to make that ITIF has touched on, and Jason as well, is the issue of cyber hacking and its role in this arena. Because it's been evident, one of the ways that China retaliates, or that we've seen, is through the use of cyber hacking of those that file trade remedy cases. And so SolarWorld, unfortunately, has been a victim of this, as have been several other companies, not in the clean energy space as much. Steel producers, the Steelworkers Union. This was laid out in an unprecedented Justice Department indictment earlier this year, where we actually indicted 5 members of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, and the United States presented a great deal of evidence that these individuals had hacked into SolarWorld and the other companies in the Steelworkers Union to obtain financial information on the company's performance, research and development information, documents of product development, information about the trade cases themselves. All of the kind of things that would definitely qualify as trade secrets under U.S. law, and that harm the U.S. companies, obviously, when that kind of activity occurs. So SolarWorld has worked very closely with the FBI and the Justice Department, and will continue to do so. But I think the U.S. government has to take a strong stand here. There can't be a way for Chinese companies to retaliate by using cyber hacking, and particularly cyber hacking in companies that file trade cases. We need to make clear that that will not be tolerated going forward, and we look forward to the U.S. government taking additional actions in that regard. So as I said, as a result of the trade cases that are ongoing, the U.S. industry has begun to recover from the devastation that it suffered in previous years. We've seen announcements again from Suniva that it will open a new module manufacturing facility in Michigan with hundreds of jobs. Solar City has announced plans to build a large solar manufacturing facility in Buffalo, New York, and then SolarWorld as well in Oregon has made that announcement, looking to expand capacity and hire hundreds of workers. So these cases are having their intended effect, and the combination of a level playing field plus a growing market for green energy that we all want to see should bode well for the continued rebirth and sort of second renaissance of green energy manufacturing here in the United States. I'd also say there's been a similar effect with regard to wind towers and wind energy, where China attempted to corner that market as well. Trade cases were filed, the playing field was leveled, and now you have U.S. wind tower manufacturers making new sales, supplying U.S. customers, the kind of things we want to see in this kind of an environment. So I think I'll leave things there. I could say some things maybe in the question and answer about some of our government procurement practices, which I think are worth looking at, and also the issue of grid parity, where renewables can really compete with other forms of energy, and how close we are to getting there on solar and wind and other areas. But I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Jason. Just maybe to add to that, I mean, one of the things that we've seen now that U.S. companies faced with kind of this unfair practices is they kind of, in a lot of ways, doubled down on innovation. SolarWorld reinvested a significant amount of money back into R&D. First Solar, kind of second generation thin film, really went back to the drawing room, and they have greatly advanced their efficiencies of their solar panels over the last few years. GE on the wind side kind of went back and looked at some of their R&D ideas to how they can make their technologies better to beat kind of those unfair practices. So in a lot of ways, the U.S. did try to, I think, use the innovation angle to counter this. And maybe I'll just throw out one question before we go to the audience, really, maybe this is more towards Jason. You talked about how we have this kind of passive response to all of this, and I wonder what an more aggressive response would look like. I know you named a few things, but does a more aggressive response look like what Tim's was just talking about, plus more policy? What are we kind of generally missing other than cohesive U.S. climate policy, which we all know kind of where that stands generally right now, right? But what else is missing, in that aggressive response?
Sure. So, and as I said, there are some bright spots here where I think things are getting better. I think Tim's point about the indictment of the People's Liberation Army officers, that's an example of how, what should be sort of an easy one for us, right? That we would obviously want to respond when a foreign government is hacking our, company's computers to gain an unfair advantage one way or the other. But, it hasn't been something to take for granted, and so, that's a welcome step. I mean, in general, I think it's, the starting point is really about doing more to enforce the existing rules. That's just sort of the first step, I think. And again, the Interagency Trade Enforcement Center will help with that. The problem with enforcement with China in particular, I think, has been, really two things. Sort of the old model of enforcement of trade rules used to be that, USTR, a pretty small outfit, about 200 or so people, that are doing not just enforcement but negotiations and everything else. The old model was really to have companies come to USTR and say, look, here are the facts. We would like you to bring a case against France or whoever the country may be. That doesn't work very well with China and a lot of other countries that are now WTO members because, for one thing, countries like China are not as transparent as countries like France, and so it's not so easy for U.S. companies to figure out what's going on in these countries, especially not so easy for small and medium-sized U.S. companies that don't have operations in these foreign countries to actually figure out what is causing, a flood of cheap imports from these countries. So there's a lack of transparency, and then the other issue is, as I mentioned before, retaliation. You've got some situations where you've got U.S. companies, big U.S. multinational companies who express concerns very quietly, but you ask them, why don't you, have USTR bring a case? They say, oh, no, we would, China would never go for that. And so there needs to be, the facts need to be developed more in-house, I think, in something like the ITEC, as opposed to relying more on U.S. companies that are often afraid to develop the cases themselves. So enforcement's a big part of it, and again, a big part of that is not so much bringing WTO cases, but also bringing cases like the one that Tim and his firm have brought, dumping and anti-subsidy cases. So enforcement, I think, is the starting point. We've also pushed for some more sort of innovative enforcement cases, such as against currency manipulation. We pushed for that for a number of years, and unfortunately that hasn't gotten much traction. So then I think the next step is developing new rules to address some of the remaining issues that aren't covered by current laws and rules. Again, Trans-Pacific Partnership gives us a very good opportunity to do that. I think for the first time we're talking about including rules on trade secret theft in a trade agreement. We're talking about, so far the administration has not yet talked about including disciplines on currency manipulation, disciplines on state-owned enterprises, and a few other rules like that. So I think that's the next step, is just developing these new rules, and then hopefully TPP will be a step in that direction.
Great, thank you. I'll give the opportunity if anybody wants to ask questions. Both Tim and Jason are free to answer anything they want. They're being taped and they know that, but they'll still say anything, right?
Actually, Matt, I was going to jump in on the more aggressive strategy too, just while people are thinking of their tough questions to ask Jason. I can suggest maybe 4 things. First of all, on the trade case front, trade cases are complicated, they're difficult to file, there are a lot of challenges there. If you think about it, you have to show that a domestic industry is injured. It's the worst possible time for a company like SolarWorld to file a trade case when it's suffering huge losses, laying off workers, to have to go through a year-long process in an arcane area like anti-dumping law. So there should be ways of making these cases easier to file and stronger, better to enforce. And unfortunately, there have been some WTO decisions that have also weakened the ability to prosecute these cases, particularly when companies, foreign companies don't respond. In the past, the Commerce Department was better able to punish them by making assumptions against the company or a foreign government that doesn't respond. And the WTO and even the US courts have started to limit that ability to use what's so-called adverse facts available against companies and governments that fail to respond to these trade cases. So that's one area where something can be done. Retaliation, as Jason said, the retaliation against the United States for the solar trade cases was that China filed cases against US manufacturers of polysilicon, which is the main raw material input into solar. And that has damaging effects for US producers, very good producers of those products. And unfortunately, it creates a situation where you're pitting, China is trying to pit the interests of one industry against another, which doesn't do it good for anyone. Also, it's worth noting that China, the European Union also filed trade cases against China, and China's response to that was to threaten trade cases against wine from France and BMWs from Germany. And that led, in part, and some other things, to a settlement of those solar cases that was not entirely favorable to the EU solar industry. And that kind of retaliation cannot be tolerated. It just won't, the system won't support it. Evasion and circumvention is another issue. Once you win these trade cases, immediately you start seeing imports shifting from other sources. Chinese imports start coming from Malaysia or Indonesia or where have you. There have been some very good proposals from Senator Wyden, and on the House side here as well, the Enforced Act, which actually passed the Senate Finance Committee on a bipartisan basis to address evasion and circumvention more quickly, so that once you win a trade case, you can enforce it and you can stop these circumventing actions. And we would certainly hope that something like that could move forward. And then on trade secrets, as Jason mentioned, it's mostly a state-based remedy, and the laws are all sort of different. So it would be great to have federal trade secret legislation and to strengthen that law, and there are proposals pending there as well. In terms of Buy America, that's another thing that I think could be part of a more aggressive strategy. The rules on solar in Buy America are particularly weak, and this unfortunately happened a few years ago, where the Buy American rules, if you go to a Defense Department facility, if you go to an Army base and so forth, the solar panels you see there are most likely not American made, even though it's US investment. And the reason for that is that there are provisions that say that the Buy American rules only apply if the US government owns the entire solar installation, and if all the power is used by the US military or the US entity. And so you have a situation where a lease will be set up, and that way the lease that goes to the US government doesn't have to use US solar panels, it can use something else. Or similarly, if some of the power is sold back into the grid, instead of all of it going to the to the Army base or the veterans housing or what have you, then you can get around the Buy American rules that way. So that would be an important thing to try and be a little more aggressive and use the Buy American rules the way they were intended. And again, the Buy America rules are open to other countries as well. The European Union has signed on to the government procurement agreement, so, but China has not. If we want to encourage China to open its procurement to the United States, maybe we provide some incentives for them to sign that agreement by making our Buy America rules in the renewable energy sector as strong as they can be. So, and then also on state-owned enterprises, as Jason mentioned, we have a great opportunity in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement to create real disciplines on state-owned enterprises. U.S. companies should not have to compete with governments and government-owned enterprises around the world. And the TPP proposals would be a very good first step. And China is not part of the TPP, but it's watching very closely what happens in those negotiations. And if that's going to be the gold standard free trade agreement for moving forward, it'd be good to get some strong rules in that agreement that can then be pushed out in other forms to cover state-owned enterprises all around the world.
Great, thanks, Ted. And so, questions, anybody? And all you have to do is say your name. You don't even have to say who you work for. Chris?
My name's Laura Bloodgood. I do work for the International Trade Commission, but I am not involved in the anti-dumping rulings in any way, shape, or form. I'm curious, we've been looking at India and a lot of work in India. We've heard a lot about China. I think maybe the issues in India revolve more around expanding U.S. markets rather than the kinds of retaliation that we've been talking about with China. And I'm just curious if any of you are familiar with the policies there, how they're evolving under the new government, and whether you see this situation changing in a way that may impact U.S. companies one way or the other.
I got to start by saying, well, we had asked for a report from
It's
ITC to answer that very question. But no, I think one thing in particular to point out there is, as you said, it'll be interesting to see whether this new government takes a different approach to some of these issues. I think there was a lot of euphoria at first from some U.S. industries about the fact that maybe there was going to be a change. I'm not sure if we've really seen that yet, unfortunately. But yeah, for a range of issues, I mean, I think some of their policies with respect to intellectual property have been a concern of ours in particular, and obviously that has an impact on clean technologies and other technologies as well. But I think we're waiting to see sort of how things go in that direction.
I don't have a lot of information. A couple of things. I know India had filed trade cases as well against China and other countries, and then decided in the end not to impose duties on solar products. I also know there are a lot of domestic preference programs that remain in India and that make it difficult for anyone to sell there. Certainly, I think an effort to identify trade barriers in India and elsewhere is the first step toward trying to get rid of those things. One thing Solar World did this year was to submit to USTR a list of all of the trade barriers that it has been able to identify around the world. And this renewable energy space is full of those kind of barriers. So I think bringing pressure to bear there is something the United States has done and should continue to do. And then I also saw something in the news this week about Exim Bank financing that might benefit U.S. producers selling in India, and that could be helpful to the industry as a whole. I mean, part of the advantage that China has from all of these subsidies and so forth is it has a massive scale, way more than is needed to supply world demand. U.S. companies should be able to scale up, and once they can do that, they can compete as well, and to have access to those markets and financing assistance would be one way to help encourage that.
Just to add on to that, one thing, to be a good example of what I was talking about, the fact that in other countries the problem is that they tend to take a very active approach to encouraging domestic production. again, on the intellectual property issue, compulsory licensing, and we take a bit of a nuanced view to compulsory licensing and recognize that WTO rules permit it in some respects. But one of the most, I think, outrageous things India has been doing is in determining whether or not to grant a compulsory license, it looks at whether or not the product is being made in India. And it's just blatantly discriminatory. And any legitimate purpose of a compulsory license is that's not being served by a focus on domestic production. It's something we would never think to do. We shouldn't think to do it, but we need to be very aggressive about going after policies like that in countries. And the other thing I wanted to say is, as Tim mentioned, and going back to Matt's original question about what can we do, I mean, another obvious thing we need to do is Exim Bank. And again, it's just the perfect example to me of how other countries are playing by just a very different set of rules than we are. You can make a good argument for why, in an ideal world, we shouldn't have an Exim Bank, but we're not in an ideal world. And it's, doing away or limiting the funding even for Exim Bank right now is truly, unilateral disarmament. And it's if you want to defeat export subsidies, you really need Exim Bank to sort of counteract subsidies that other countries are putting in place if we ever want to have that ability.
Maybe just a follow-up maybe to that. I think it was last week, Prime Minister Modi gave a speech where he called for some new global collaboration on clean energy innovation, and where countries should co-invest with each other, maybe on a bilateral basis, and share the IP kind of around the world. And this kind of mimics in some way the U.S.-China climate announcement, where there was a number of kind of underlying innovation agreements, the U.S.-China Research Center and some work on carbon capture. I mean, is that a viable path forward, something like that, or are these other trade barriers have to be kicked out? I mean, can you bilaterally work with India on clean tech innovation while they still have local trade barriers and content requirements? I mean, what do you think?
I mean, it's a little tough unless their market's open. I mean, I think the first thing is to remove the trade barriers and open the markets, and then find ways to work together. So, and again, these barriers are particularly prevalent in this space, renewable energy. People see the promise of this industry. They want to have manufacturing in their own countries, and they will create incentives, both legal and WTO illegal, to accomplish that.
Hi, Dave Thomas, Inside U.S. Trade. You've mentioned, all of you have mentioned kind of like how we need to go from from being passive in terms of kind of developing kind of like the green industry to more active. I was hoping you guys could describe kind of what are the proposals out there, and what exactly is the likelihood that this will come to fruition, given the fact that we have a Republican-controlled Congress that I believe you, sir, had noted that they're not entirely on board with some of the policies to perhaps maybe start that, restart the green industry here.
That's a tough question. I think to some extent we've already answered some of the policies, and every policy that Tim mentioned, I think, is something we support. A good example is the customs anti-circumvention bill. Is actually part of my boss's overall customs bill, and we're hopeful that can move forward next year. And it's a good example. You mentioned Republican control of the Congress next year. As Tim mentioned, I believe the Senate Finance Committee unanimously approved the Enforce Act. So there are areas where we can work together. But again, I think to me my overall point today is the only way we can build support for clean technologies is by taking a more assertive approach to mercantilism and to leveling the playing field. Again, I go back to the debate we had a few years ago over the climate change bill. What we were hearing from many on the other side of the aisle was, and what I also heard just whatever it was last week ago in the APEC announcement between China and the U.S. about China agreeing to some targets. you heard folks on the other side saying, well, this is just going to lead to a loss of U.S. jobs. This is just going to lead to carbon linkage. And so to me, the whole point is the only way you can build support for doing something about climate change is by also putting in place measures that make sure that it doesn't lead to a loss of jobs here. And I think that's where you can build bipartisan consensus to put in place regional measures like border adjustments that are designed to do no more than ensure a level playing field. I think there will be bipartisan support for those sorts of measures. There hasn't been on things like Exim Bank, that's for sure. But I think I'm hopeful that we can move in that direction there as well.
I guess I would underscore, a lot of things happened after the election results, but one of the things that happened was an announcement that it seems like one area where the Obama administration and Congress can work together might be on trade. That does open an opportunity, not just for Trade Promotion Authority, but for legislation that could be included or part of that to strengthen the trade laws, for example. We haven't had any legislation to strengthen the trade laws in 20 years since the Uruguay round and the creation of the WTO. In the meantime, our trade laws have been eroded by WTO decisions and in some cases by US court decisions as well. So there are some small steps that can be taken to streamline trade cases, to make things easier for the Commerce Department as it's reviewing these cases. And those are the kind of things that could be done as part of a fast-track effort. I think trade secrets is another area that should be bipartisan. No one disagrees that it's a bit of a problem when China encourages a U.S. company to set up a joint venture and then sets up another factory across the street and takes all the intellectual property. So again, I think trade secrets is something that can be bipartisan in nature. And frankly, I think green energy, it hasn't been cast as bipartisan, and we sort of got bogged down in Solyndra and loan guarantees and things like that. But really, you're talking about jobs and manufacturing in the United States, and members of Congress all care about that, whether they're Republican or Democrat. And so, I think there ought to be ways to work together on that to strengthen manufacturing here in the United States, and that should play well in the next election cycle, like it does in most. So those are things I would think that could be efforts that are bipartisan.
And that, to extend on that, I mean, innovation in general typically is an area of bipartisan support. And even on the clean tech side, you look on the National Network of Manufacturing Innovation, which has bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate, would greatly increase our manufacturing competitiveness compared to a lot of these other countries. There's a bill, both the House and Senate, to create manufacturing universities to ensure that we're producing enough industry-relevant engineers in an area like clean energy so it makes not just economic sense, but just pragmatic sense to have your manufacturing facilities in the United States, which would help all industries, not just clean tech. And in areas like research and development, while those numbers have decreased and sort of stagnated since the stimulus, it's an area where there is some level of bipartisan support, depending on how close to commercialization you get, to make sure the U.S. is at the kind of bleeding edge. Even if you look at China's 5-year plan, they're looking largely at first-generation technologies. They haven't really done much on things like thin film solar, or in the U.S. is it's really at the leading edge on battery technology, an area that South Korea, for example, has been a leader in for many years, and we've kind of really picked up our game in the last 5 or 6 years on the innovation side, and that's an area that we can continue doing on a bipartisan basis. And even it's a domestic policy. It creates domestic industries. It doesn't involve kind of these trade issues. So you can make kind of additional economic growth arguments in addition to what our international competitiveness is. So I think there's a lot that can be done there and is already kind of growing and kind of moving through Congress. Yep.
Hi, my name is Catherine Bial. I'm with the International Trade Administration and Commerce. Just like my ITC colleague, I'm not with the Port Administration. I just want to alert people that a couple of years ago we started developing a product called the Top Market Study, where we look at U.S. Exports markets for U.S. companies in the renewable energy and energy efficiency sector. And what we do is we rank foreign countries in terms of how attractive they are for U.S. Renewable energy and energy efficiency companies. We break it down by country, and then we also break it down at the sectoral level. Originally, when we did this report, it was frankly for various U.S. government agencies to prioritize their resources. Then we realized how valuable this could be to U.S. companies, so we cleaned it up and put it on the website, but it's a pretty good product.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question, if anybody wants to have the final word before we wrap up.
We can't have this copy, but I can...
Sorry, one more question. I guess kind of like, what is your response to like other parts of the U.S. industry that are perhaps like not a fan of, for instance, a Solar World's trade case against China? I mean, the Solar Energy Industries Association has been very critical of those trade cases. So what is your response to those parts of the U.S. industry who feel that these trade cases are perhaps not helping as much as Solar World says?
I'll start. Well, and any other, I think I've already said it before. I mean, what the last year has shown is that the U.S. industry can compete and that green energy can grow if the playing field is level. And so, there are some companies whose business model is based on dumped and subsidized Chinese imports. That's a short-term thing that won't last and isn't sustainable. The thing that will make green energy grow is to have a strong U.S. industry, including a strong manufacturing industry. And I talked about the innovation. I was at the Solar Power International Trade Show in Las Vegas a few weeks ago, and it was remarkable to me that China was selling 250, 260 watt solar panels, and Solar World was rolling out its 280 watt solar panel, and there were other U.S. manufacturers on the high end as well. I mean, the real innovation, to a large extent, is coming from U.S. producers. So you have to have a manufacturing base. You have to have investment, like the DOE grants, which are matching grants. Solar World's investing there too. That's what's going to be best in the long run. So we understand that the cases are not universally supported by everyone, but again, they're looking at a short-term fix, not what's best for this industry and this country over the long term.
And maybe to be a little more aggressive, I think the solar industry, at least that portion of it, needs to decide whether it wants to just focus on the short term or focus on the long term viability. Do you want to make a bet on, would you rather make a bet on whether China will continue to subsidize its panels at below market rates, or make a bet that the United States and other countries will continue to innovate cheaper and better products that can be sold in the market without those subsidies or without those mandates? And I think me personally, I make the bet on the innovation side that we'll continually make those products better, rather than hoping that another country or countries will continue to sell those products at a loss. I think that holds much better for the long-term viability of the industry in general. And yes, that may impact it in the short term, certainly, but in the long term, we'll be much healthier. Any other questions?
Is there any data that shows that the not environmentally friendly manufacturing processes of these Chinese firms as they produce solar cells has, far more negative externalities than the cleaner production process that we use in the United States for the production of solar cells?
I can't give you the exact source, but yes, there have been studies, first of all, that I talked about how the United States has the comparative advantage in solar, and that's particularly true when we think about China using coal-fired power plants to power its solar manufacturing facilities, to build solar panels, to put on large ocean-going freight vessels that also pollute a lot to bring to the United States and the European Union. So there has been some analysis of that, and we can talk afterwards, that the carbon footprint of the US industry and the EU industry is, I believe, about half of the Chinese industry for making these products. That is a huge difference, and that's, you know, that should be more well known than it is.
And even, I think, farther upstream, looking at like critical materials, where China's environmental regulations are remarkably more lax than they are elsewhere, and yet they're producing a lot of these materials that go into these products. So I think that's a growing concern. Any other questions?
I'm Mary Berger with Washington Trade Daily. I don't think anyone mentioned the environmental goods agreement negotiations that are going on right now in the WTO. Are those helpful, or because they're strictly about tariff elimination and not non-tariff barriers, are they not that helpful?
I think it's still helpful. I mean, the United States already has zero duties on solar panels coming in, but if other countries, if we can convince other countries to lower their tariffs to zero, and it's a broad range of goods too. I mean, what's considered environmental goods is pretty wide ranging under this agreement. That could potentially open new markets for U.S. producers, and that's a good thing. And China is a party to the negotiations, so that's important. Now, one thing I'll note, there's been this would only cover regular tariffs. It wouldn't cover anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties, and obviously that wouldn't make any sense to try and somehow cover trade remedies in environmental goods. But in terms of lowering tariffs and lowering barriers, that could make a contribution, even if it isn't going to address all the local content requirements and other things that are out there.
Yeah, and we're kind of taking a wait-and-see approach to this. I think conceivably, we would agree with Tim that a tariff-only environmental goods agreement could be a very good thing. We've been very supportive of the information technology agreement because we look at those products and we believe that, you know, tariffs really are the issue. And of course, there are already in place quite a few rules to address non-tariff barriers. Maybe not all the rules that we need, but quite a few. So I think it just is going to depend on exactly what products are part of that agreement. You know, for example, if we're talking about hybrid vehicles, I can tell you we have some non-tariff barriers that we would want to address before we would agree to duty-free treatment on hybrid vehicles from some of our trading partners. But you know, there are other products, I think, where we aren't aware of any non-tariff barriers and believe that existing disciplines would probably do a pretty good job of addressing them.
I think you might have gotten the last word, Jason. Jason, Tim, thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you all for joining in, and enjoy the rest of your Friday and have a good weekend.